Okay, hello everyone. My name is James Jesso. This is the Adventures Through the Mind podcast. Today, instead of a one-on-one episode, we have a Psychedelic Café. A Psychedelic Café is a kind of like a digital sharing circle that unfolds over 3 rounds. It's a conversational technology that allows for emergent and dynamic discussion around a central question in a group of people with varying, sometimes contrasting perspectives. Today, the question explores how do we, in psychedelic culture, deal with the issues and problems within that culture, in particular things like bad actors and negative corporate influence. Before I introduce the participants in this cafe, I want to give a big shout out to Jean Robertson of the Liminal Space Agency, a meta-monastery here in Kitchener, Ontario. Her work with what's called Dharma Talking is basically exactly what the Psychedelic Cafe is, sort of reappropriated with different language so that it applies to the psychedelic theme of this show. But ultimately, this conversational technology is Dharma Talking and is a product of Jean Robertson and the Liminal Space Agency. You can find out more about Jean. She's been on the show. I'll put a link in the description to this episode. Check her out. She's cool. In fact, heavily contributed to my sort of mindset thinking around human relationships and culture in general. So check her out. Okay, so now let's get into who's talking for this episode of the Psychedelic Cafe here on Adventures Through the Mind. In alphabetical order according to their last name, the participants are myself, James Jesso, your host, as well as Marta Ketchmarchek, co-founder and coordinator of the Psychedelic Society of the Netherlands and facilitator at Synthesis, a psilocybin retreat center in Amsterdam. We also have Trevor Millar, owner of Liberty Root Therapy, chair for MAPS Canada, and on the founding board of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. We have Jeronimo MM of ICEERS, which is the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research, and Service. Anya Oleksiuk, psychedelic documentary filmmaker and co-owner and co-director of the Psychedelic Society UK. Brian Pace, the politics and ecology editor for Psymposia and professor of psychedelic studies at Ohio State University. Marisa Sturtz, also a filmmaker and co-founder of Lucid News. And last but not least, Bet Williams, author of The Wild Kindness, a Psilocybin Odyssey. Well, I don't think I need to explain to you the context as to why a group discussion about how to deal with the problems that are emerging in psychedelic culture in a way that gives rise to actual solutions and the importance of having a dynamic, respectful group discussion about those things with different people coming from different places attempting to do it in different ways. I mean, it seems evident that type of adult maturity in diverse conversations or in conversations addressing systemic issues is a good idea. We should just do that. And so that's why this podcast has been brought together. So I don't really need to explain it to you. I think that's evident. And I'm hoping that out of the this conversational technology of the Psychedelic Cafe, something very interesting emerges for you, not just in listening to what each person's saying, but wondering about what dynamics exist that aren't being spoken to. What are people not saying? As a participant, as someone who is participating through spectating in this conversation, what is it that you see out of the exploration of the question, as well as how the exploration of the question is being, how it exists interpersonally between all of us in the discussion? What does it give rise to insofar as trying to understand how do we solve and address the problems in psychedelic culture? So there's a lot to chew on here, and I hope that you get something chewy and delicious out of it. Before we jump into the cafe, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Without your generous support, this podcast would not exist, and none of us would get to take part in what comes of it. So thank you so much to my patrons on Patreon. The people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or listed in the description to this episode are people who are giving $23 a month or more. Big thanks to you. If you are not yet a patron and you'd like to support the show financially and you're committed to doing so monthly, even something as little as the price of a cup of coffee once a month contributes to the overall income that allows me to continuously invest with time and money into the production and sustainability of the show, as well as the growth of the show. So please do so by becoming a patron on Patreon. You can head to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. If you just want to throw me a couple bucks for a cool episode that you enjoyed, kind of like a tip, you can do so by heading to the links in the description to this episode, and the one-time donation options are PayPal or cryptocurrency. Thank you very much for supporting the show. I appreciate it. Okay, so that's the intro. Please enjoy this Psychedelic Cafe here on Adventures Through the Mind, exploring how do we address and solve the problems present in psychedelic culture. Enjoy. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Psychedelic Cafe. This is a conversation that's going to go on through 3 distinct rounds, and the structure of each round will be described at the beginning of which, and we're going to open with introductions. So I will start with myself. My name is James Jesso. I'm the host of this podcast, and I am here because I think this is an important discussion, and I feel excited to engage in a cafe around it with each of you who are gathered here today. So.
Hello, thank you, James, for inviting me to the cafe. Hello, my name is Marta Ketchmarchek, and I'm originally from Poland. I live in the Netherlands. I'm a co-founder and coordinator of the Dutch Psychedelic Society. I'm also involved in psychedelic community in other ways. I work for Synthesis Retreat. I'm a facilitator and customer journey expert at Synthesis. I've been also involved in multiple projects in psychedelic community involving also like what to do, like resolving problems around bad actors, looking into harm reduction and harm prevention in psychedelic at psychedelic retreats. I guess that's basically it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeronimo. I work for ICEERS, which is a Barcelona-based NGO. It's the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Services. And we are an NGO whose aim is to transform the relationship of global north societies to a series of plants that have a history of traditional use. And I think that the reason that I'm here in this podcast is because, well, we've been giving now for many years a lot of thought to many of the questions that will be addressed during this conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me, James. This is awesome. My name is Marisa Sturtz. I'm a filmmaker. I have a doc series on Gaia TV, helping introduce how psychedelics work to the mainstream. I'm also a co-founder of Lucid News and curator at the Aware Project in Los Angeles. Also the founder of the Psychedelic Leadership Summits. And I'm probably here because I really am excited about bridge building and communication and connecting everybody as much as possible. So excited to see this all happen today.
I think that might be me next. My name is Trevor Millar. I am the owner of a company called Liberty Root Therapy Limited, and we're based in Vancouver. Liberty Root provided ibogaine to almost 200 people while it was legal to do so here in Canada. Ibogaine, a plant medicine that's really good at helping people overcome opioid use disorder, which is what the majority of my clients had. And through that work, I was invited to be chair of the board for MAPS Canada. And I am on the founding board of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, and I imagine I was invited to this call for all of those reasons in my introduction.
Hi there, my name, did I miss the order here?
I think there was a little mix-up, but yeah, Brian, why don't you go next, and then Anya, you can jump in there.
Sure, I didn't want to bump anyone. My name's Brian Pace. I am the politics and ecology editor for Psymposia. I'm a PhD evolutionary ecologist, and I teach psychedelic studies at The Ohio State University. I've also been involved in the Psychedelic Society movement, founded something called Mind Manifest Midwest out here in Columbus, Ohio. And I imagine I'm on this call because of the work that I've done with Psymposia, and perhaps particularly because of a piece I wrote back in February called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, Psychedelics, and the Right Wing.
So I guess it's me now. Thank you for inviting me, James. And my name is Anya Oleksiuk. I'm co-owner and co-director of the Psychedelic Society of UK, and also filmmaker, psychedelic documentary filmmaker. And I guess I'm here because those subjects have been quite alive in my life last few months, and I've been in many, many discussions trying to solve them. And I am interested in solving them further with this group of people here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Bet Williams, and I'm the writer of a book called The Wild Kindness, a Psilocybin Odyssey that just came out. And I was generously invited into the circle of psychedelic people, first through Via Labate and through Kruna, and have just been continuing through writing for Lucid News and Double Blind to continue these relationships. But I think of myself as a rogue citizen user and a writer of literature first and foremost. And I imagine I'm here because of that outside status.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're going to get started with the structure of the conversation, entering the first stage of it. In this stage, we're each going to go through in the same order and share one clear, coherent thought on the question, which I will read off in a moment. If you are not ready to share your thought, you can pass and we'll come back to you at the end. So the question, what is the and also I'm gonna answer the question last because I don't want to cede everyone else's thoughts. The question, what is the best way to address and resolve the conflicts or problems present in psychedelic culture, be it bad actors, bad faith arguments, political, corporate corruption, conspiracies, etc.? And we'll start with Marta.
I think I need a bit more time to think about this. It's difficult to have one coherent thought about such a complex issue.
Okay, I can go next. I think I'm just going to focus, for these 5 minutes in one part of the question, which is that of bad actors. But I think a lot of the answer applies for the rest as well. I think perhaps there's another aspect of, what is called psychedelic exceptionalism, which is used to say that people who take psychedelics believe that they're not part of. That there's another aspect to this exceptionalism, and there is that we believe that certain things that happen in the world should not happen in the psychedelic community because we're taking psychedelics and somehow we're better, I don't know, more woke. So none of the issues that are unique to the psychedelic community. They're society-wide issues, and you can see them appear in all sorts of other places. So for myself, when I try to focus problems in the psychedelic communities, I always try to look outside to sort of bring some sort of commonality or common sense into the question. For example, bad actors are a problem everywhere. For example, psychiatry, medicine, lawyers. And of course, these let's call them industries or estimates or whatever. There are, many of them have all sorts of regulations to try to avoid this from happen. And these regulations work to a point, and then they don't work. There's nothing you can do to stop all the bad actors. So, I would like to start by saying that there's always going to be bad actors. There was a recent case with an ayahuasca provider was both a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and it was a recent sexual abuse scandal. Well, this person had received all the training that we would hope that future psychedelic therapists of the future will receive, including ample training and supervision to try to avoid exactly this thing from happen. And yet this still happens. So, that's one thing, Now, I think you can argue with reason that, with these regulations in place, it happens less. But, so that would be one thing, I think you can't avoid, you can't fully avoid certain things from happening in the psychedelic communities that always happen everywhere. And then the other thing is that I think the way things are in the rest of the world is that, for example, I don't know, you look at literature and you look at filmmaking, is that, there's a small subset of people who are doing very good work and are advancing, let's say, the art form. I consider work with psychedelics sort of our art form, actually, more than a science. And then, so there's people doing incredible filmmaking, and then there's people doing, mediocre filmmaking, and then there's a whole bunch of bad movies. And this is the way of the world, and it's always going to be like this. The way I tend to think about dealing with this issue is not how do we stop people from making bad movies. You're never going to stop people from making bad movies. What you do is you create, academies, institutions that recognize the work of good people. You create good, filmmaking schools, and, you try to focus on the craft and the art, and you try to make it as good as possible for the people who are interested in doing as good as possible work, with the knowledge that, 20, 15 years into the future, whenever it is that psychedelics are legal and integrated in our societies, I believe it will be like everything else. There will be a group of people doing incredible work. There will be a group of people doing so-so work. And there will be a whole bunch of people doing the worst imaginable work. Or just, call it what you will. It's like this with music. It's like this with poetry. It's like this with psychiatry, with cooking. Is like this with just about any other human activity. So I would say, and I think I'm getting close to the 5 minutes, there's two aspects to the approach of bad actors. One is, of course, to have certain regulations in place to try to stop it from happening, knowing that you can't ever fully stop it. And the other one has to do with educating the demand. In this situation that I described of the psychiatrist knew fully well that what he was doing was wrong. However, the person being abused didn't understand this. And it took this person a long time to actually understand what had happened and what had taken place, and then to take the measures. So, I think a lot of the effort that we are doing also in ICEERS, in other organizations, has to do with improving the work at the provider level. And of course, this is very important. But there's another aspect of this work, which is educating the demand, so that people know what to expect, what is good work, what is bad work, what are their rights, right? You don't need, people can tell, good food from bad food. And this is how things sort themselves out. And I find this approach useful when I look at these things. I don't know if that's the thought.
Do you want to continue, Marisa? Do you want to continue, Marisa? Yeah, or
oh, do you want to go back? Do we go to Marta now, or do we come back to her?
Well, we were going to come back to her at the end.
Okay,
if
cool.
That's okay with you, Marta?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Great. And just to clarify, James, so there is no only to agree with what the person said before, but not to point out any.
You don't even have to address it at all. You're just sharing one clear, coherent thought, and so we're all just sort of like planting a seed, and then we'll see what grows when we enter the second stage and the conversation's more open.
And then we respond to each other's if we want to. Okay,
yeah.
Got it. Beautiful. Yeah. So this has come up in multiple facets of my involvement in the psychedelic space, and I've been part of many conversations, both internationally and within my own community in Los Angeles, and now here in Costa Rica. And I believe that I have a two-pronged answer to it. The first one, a great handful of you here have been to the psychedelic leadership summits that have been held. And what they were was one-day gatherings where people led discussions or spoke on topics that were of concern, shared concern within the community. And what the feedback was from everyone was like, wow, that's really cool. I'm so glad to meet everyone, and I don't feel so alone. We're all sharing a lot of the same burdens. And holy shit, that was really heavy and my head hurts. And we left feeling depleted and exhausted. And it was, this has been an evolution of process of learning how can we approach these heavy topics without those end results, because you don't really want to go back. It becomes a thing you have to do out of obligation and burden. And so it's really invited a lot of inquiry into how can we approach these very important subjects, but from a place of feeling resourced, and how can we better serve when we are in that place of feeling resourced. And what keeps coming up for me in my inquiries has been community. How can we first build a foundation of bonds of connection outside of all the conflict, but as humans, how can we connect? And then once we know each other and we have these relationships and there is some play and there is some fun, then, okay, let's go into the deep end of the pool and start untangling some of this mess. And then let's go back, and I think it's really about finding the balance of going into the heavy stuff and then connecting again as humans and creating the joy and the play. So I have found now from that, with that as a more balanced place, the answers make themselves more clear, more readily available. And then the other part that I feel really helps is that the people doing the hard labor on mediating conflicts with out of alignment practitioners, that there be compensation for the emotional labor that's involved in unpacking this, and that there really be a structure and a framework that ensures that people, the accused, the accusee, that both sides are being held, and that the process is being held from the beginning to the end, so that things don't, that people don't get exhausted halfway through and they're like, well, the guy, he has a ruined reputation now and he's left town, it's good enough. But rather that whole process is seen, and that the person who has seen through it to its completion, and the person that's helping oversee that, be compensated for their energy that is expended, so that way it really gets to be done completely. And that both the accuser and the accusee have people helping hold hands throughout the entire process. That's my 5 minutes.
I think I went out of place last time, so should Brian go, or?
I think you can just go ahead, Trevor, and Brian can go after you if that's cool for Brian.
Cool. Your call, Brian.
I'm prepared to go if you want.
Go for it.
Okay, so what's the best way to address and resolve problems in the psychedelic space relating to, what was it, bad actors, corporate influence, conspiracies? Am I missing one?
Yeah, I don't know, but generally you've got the gist of it. Yeah,
we got the gist. So that's kind of what Psymposia does. That's sort of our beat. We have set ourselves out and made a commitment to our community to be a watchdog for the public interest in the psychedelic space. And it's not exactly because we wanted to play that role. It's because that we saw that anyone filling that role was an absent slot. So it's not pleasant stuff. When we're talking about bad actors, though, I think it's a good idea to get specific. We're usually referring to abusive behavior, culty stuff, and or, because it can be just isolated events or the whole gamut, sexual abuse. Usually under the influence of psychedelics or within a relationship that may be therapeutic or shamanic or, even recreational. So, and then with regard to conspiracies, we just put out a piece on it. I generally think that education is a good way to address these things. However, a lot of that is really beyond the scope of what any one individual or one institution can do, which is one of the reasons why Psymposia is in solidarity with broader left movements to bring more social programs to the impoverished everywhere. When it comes to corporate influence, now that is a rough nut to crack. However, I would say that knowledge is power. And most of the corporate influence in the psychedelic space is actually a bunch of well-financed individuals, often from everything from mining to fracking to banking. And they have a very close game that they're playing. They're not showing their cards until they have all their pieces in place. And so the corporadelics section of Psymposia that has been built out by Russell Hausfeld and David Nichols really is a roadmap to the who's who of the individuals who would very much like to corner the market on psychedelics. These people do not like competition. They have effectively demonstrated this by seeking IP, intellectual property, so that they can exclude others from certain aspects of what they consider to be a virgin market that is going to be the next big bubble. Now, we have advocated for a structural critique on Psymposia and continue to outline it. We're not interested in making our first $1 million on the psychedelic renaissance, or resurgence is actually what I would rather call what's happening right now. We're about changing the world in some ways, or at least I am. I've been staring down the barrel of climate change for 10 years with my PhD research. And I've been attracted to psychedelics because I've been taking them for all of my adult life as tools for transformation. But tools can be used to bash somebody's head in or build a cathedral. And it's about how we apply ourselves and what ideals we commit ourselves to. And personally, I think that building a world where a bad trip is a lot harder to have, because we are resourced in a material way, because we are supported in real communities that have accountability, that is important. And I gotta say, this comes from having the hard conversations and having them in public, especially when people are making silly statements in public, whether they are just erroneous or whether they're like sort of malicious and misleading. So we are about naming names. We are about adversarial journalism because somebody needs to say the thing. So we'll continue to do that so long as it's necessary. And looking around the space, I'm gonna say that's going to be for a very long time. So check out Psymposia.com, and thank you, James, for inviting me on the show.
Thanks, everyone, so far. Great comments. This is kind of where the Canadian Psychedelic Association was born. Last summer, a group of about 35 people, all who had worked within the plant medicine space for kind of at least 5 years or more each, came together, and we saw here in Canada what happened to cannabis when money entered the equation, and we kind of got together to say, is there anything we can do in order to prevent that from happening to psychedelics? So the CPA was essentially born out of that. And I think an answer that's already been given here that I think is perhaps the best we can do right now, which might ultimately be a great solution, is community, is to bring people together, is to bring people out of the shadows, is within that community to hold people accountable. I feel as though we've got a chance of creating a new paradigm of doing business with psychedelics. I might be, Jeronimo mentioned psychedelic exceptionalism. I might be guilty of that, because my kind of feeling when I first stepped onto the stage with the Canadian Psychedelic Association is I was very dismayed with a lot of the kind of fracture that I started seeing in the psychedelic community as money moved into the space, as a few different things happened. And I thought, wow, if we as the psychedelic community who have access to these transformational, unifying medicines can't find a way to get along with each other, then I'm not sure there's too much hope for the rest of the world. So I was probably a bit naive in thinking that. I think, as Jeronimo said, there's going to be bad actors in every single space. It's just what can we do to mitigate the damage? And I think community is a really good resource in that regard. I think, to maybe bring a second thought into this, sorry, James, is with that new paradigm, like, is it possible to move into a paradigm of doing business where we don't compete with each other? There is, arguably 7 billion people that need to be healed on Earth right now. That's a lot of business opportunity. And I think if we all work towards collective healing, that there's more than enough business for everyone. And I personally feel that the motto for every business that's entering the psychedelic space should be healing ourselves out of business. I think should ultimately be the goal, because I think that's a potential that these medicines hold. Again, I may be idealistic in that view, but I've seen some pretty miraculous things in my almost 10 years of working with these substances.
Yes, we've been seeing a lot of issues, especially during Corona, in the community. Psychedelic Society of UK has a very big community of 60,000 people. So it comes with a big responsibility, and often why I see a lot of bypassing of racial issues or of trauma. I see this like daily, and it breaks my heart. And we've been wondering what to do with it for a while. Definitely, we decided not to respond to any angry comments on Facebook. Instead, I think that education and raising of the awareness worked the best. We invited as many speakers as we could to speak about the issues, whether there were racial issues or whether there was a mainstreaming. We just decided to make as much content as possible, and I think events, and also to make those events affordable. So raising awareness of all of this, with bad actors also promoting the right actors, really promoting the good alternatives and speaking about them. So concentrating not only on the bad, but also saying it's possible to do it a different way. For example, as society, we decided on this new paradigm of being an organization where co-op, it's a horizontal organization, and we're trying to inspire other organizations to go this way as well. So the power is more balanced and nobody's taking advantage. So creating alternatives, new paradigms, and planting the seed within the community, because then they spread the knowledge further, and just give them tools in order for them to educate others. Probably not 5 minutes, but that's my one coherent thought, I hope.
Hi, I guess it's my turn. Let's see, I've been, one coherent thought is, I'm extremely left in my political leanings, and with my book out, I've been asked 3 times in 2 days, how do mushrooms dismantle white supremacy, right? And what is the right answer to that? And the mushrooms were like, is that our job? and they're very funny in that way. And I ended up going into Google to refresh myself on Hannah Arendt, who is a speaker on the division between the personal and the public, the private and the public. And I thought back to what happened in the 60s when a lot of the civil rights movements were, 1, dismantled by Nixon, and 2, dismantled by CIA and a kind of personalization of the psychedelic experience, because what is a psychedelic but an extreme interior drama? So it's something easily weaponized. It's really grandiose. It's large, but it's also not public. And so there's such a difficulty in linking our political activism to such an interior, grandiose experiment. So, just on all sides of the political spectrum, I wonder if we need to kind of have a moral and ethical reconfiguring of the place of the psychedelic in terms of the public political spectrum. And so I guess my answer would be to the question of, do mushrooms dismantle white supremacy? I would say no. Human beings, I dismantle white supremacy. Like, to use this kind of language around these things, I think it's weaponized on all different sides, and it's become like a kind of a re-education camp. Like, as long as you come up with the correct answer to that question. But it's something I think we really need to explore in terms of the fact that all of us do care and align with the movements politically that we want to succeed. What is the right size way to speak about psychedelics' place? And what I'm seeing on the left is a kind of commodification of these like Twitter hot point issues in order to like bring a kind of focus to like what you're doing, what you're trying to sell, what you're trying to talk about. But I think we need to take it more seriously. So like a kind of rearrangement of the personal versus the public in our discourse around psychedelics. So that's what I have to say.
Marta, I'll just, and then you can jump in as if you're just on the tail end. So, I mean, having initiated this conversation, my coherent thought is around why ultimately this conversation exists, or why I wanted to get more feedback on it. And it definitely relates to a number of things that have been said so far. And one of those things, or sorry, I just switched to a different view, and now I got confused in my comments here. One of which is that it's obvious that we're in a situation where established structures of authority are understandably and I think justly disintegrating, and those things, and as a consequence, larger systemic issues are coming into the fore, and we're trying to figure out ways to take down the structures that propagate these systemic issues, and then we're also trying to figure out ways to basically conduct ourselves differently so that they no longer harm or oppress or what have you. And that also, these things are happening outside of the psychedelic culture and community, but they're also, in some sense, we'll find micro expressions of them within the psychedelic culture as well. And that we're doing something similar for how those systemic issues express within psychedelic culture. And my wondering is around, especially given that having a deep and profound experience does not make you a deep and profound person, and having taken a lot of psychedelics doesn't by any means mean that you are now more emotionally mature, more capable of handling conflict, more capable of assessing complex situations and addressing them in ways that are expressions of collaboration, maturity, and actually seeding the new way of being in the world that you would like to have. It's very easy to think that we're doing that, but ultimately just offering more of the same. And so in a larger cultural sort of landscape that seems to be very full of ego inflation and heavily rivalrous dynamics and sort of like pseudo-moralistic chanting of like, yes, we know what is right and good for the world, be it on the political right or the political left, or reactions to each in ways that feel almost fundamentally immature, be they bonding through bullying or name-calling or villainizing or victimizing or expressing victimology or whatever it is, conflating conflict with abuse, and doing things that aren't necessarily helpful to resolving issues. They're just sort of moving conflict around and never really laying a foundation that's positive for what I might hope for we could step into. And I think this is something that to me feels like something we could bring out of that personal psychedelic space and into the public space, which is a more anti-rivalrous way of conducting the world, sort of the infinite game rather than the finite game of winner, loser, prove, like attack, moral, like, yeah, kind of like we're the better righteous ones or whatever it might be. And then holding that while also recognizing that there are a bunch of people that are still rivalrous and want to dominate and want to take over and want to, whatever it is, like the worst expressions of humanity. And my deep wondering is like, okay, so how do we call that larger discussion in to psychedelic culture, dealing with psychedelic issues, so that we're not falling into that same immature camp? Because we're just as likely to do it as any other subsection of society. Maybe more likely to be aware that we could do it, but ultimately just as likely to do it. And so that's sort of like, and I also live in a little bubble where most of my interactions are screen mediated, and the actual people I'm having long, deep conversations with are a small handful of people. And I might be totally checked out of what is the objective reality of the world, even though I feel like I've got a handle on it. So I've invited all of you to come on so that we could just have an open discussion and we can all share where we're coming from. And hopefully, as a consequence, something insightful will arise. So that's my singular thought, Marta.
Right, thank you, James. The reason why I needed a bit more time is, for me, that's such an enormous topic. And I think I kind of struggle with like generalization of that question, because for me, each type of bad actor would require a different response. So I decided to focus now on kind of like what I do at the local level. So I'm part of the organization called Guild of Guides. And we're a group of facilitators, because in the Netherlands we have psilocybin truffles are legal. So we have multiple retreats that offer psilocybin truffles experience. And these are people who are one-on-one session guides and group session guides. So we're trying to create a self-regulating organization, which we have our own code of ethics. And we're trying to gather the feedback from all the actors in the group, and we're trying to get involved everyone in the community and listen to people why they behave in a certain way, and decide as a group what to do with so-called bad actors. And there are multiple problems with the solution, because obviously that requires a lot of time and work, both on practical level, but also that there's a lot of emotional work, because there are lots of disagreements. People who agreed to be kind of leaders of the group also need to step away from their own ego and their idea what's bad and what's good, and kind of listen to the feedback, which is sometimes challenging. And also, one problem is that sometimes bad actors do not want to be part of such community. And then it's extremely difficult to decide what to do with those people who don't want to be engaged in the conversation. Like, what do we do? How do we warn others, warn prospective participants from those people, from those peoples? So it's such a difficult topic on so many levels, and yeah, I believe local community work for multiple bad actors, it's kind of an education. It's one step towards resolving it. Thank you.
Okay, so we're now entering the second stage of the conversation. This is a free form. We all talk, whatever topics come up, respond to each other, always speaking into the circle. Non sequiturs are welcome. Follow-ups and callbacks are welcome, and also space, dead silent, dead space. I think that's what it's called. Also welcome. So here we are.
Let's talk about business for a minute. The idea, and actually some of the, I would like to, I don't want to mess this up. So I want to talk about business. I want to talk about rivalry. Business and whether or not something can be competitive or not. Let's get specific and talk about some of the big investors in the psychedelic space. One of them is a guy named Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's a billionaire. He's real big on data. He created a company called Palantir that sometimes is used to kill people with the data. Peter Thiel does not, he's on the record, like competition. In fact, what he would like to do is create an environment where his businesses and the things that he invests in are the dominating force in that market. So on one of the businesses that he has invested in is Compass Pathways. Compass Pathways has George Goldsmith at the helm, and his previous incarnation was with Tapestry Networks that specialized in something that we call regulatory capture. So in terms of whether or not there's like enough opportunity for all of us to have business, like I'm critical of capitalism on a basic human civilizational like sustainability level. So I'm not really interested in those models generally speaking. But when it comes down to the like stated intentions of the people who are the biggest investors in the psychedelic space, and the resume of the individuals who are running the most resourced corporation in the psychedelic space. I think that is super important. And then when we're talking about rivalry and whether or not anti-rival kinds of methods can be pursued, that we don't have to take sides, I would defer to Anand Haridas, who is a thinker on these topics, and he wrote a book about the fallacy of win-win, the idea that somehow we can enrich the rulers of the world while somehow empowering the poor. It doesn't make any sense on a basic level. And so we are talking about zero-sum politics. We are talking about people who would like to corner the market and exclude everyone from these things and build giant white picket fences around the psychedelic experience and the ineffable. And then there are other movements towards decriminalization. And there's the psychedelic exceptionalist version, or I would argue there's the bigger game and the bigger prize, which is the decriminalization of all drugs, which is something that I think very few like institutions in the space will openly advocate for, but that's something that Psymposia is on record over and over advocating for.
Psychedelics were never my end game. Ibogaine was never my end game. They just happened to show up on my path as ways to end suffering, which was my end game. I decided 20 years ago to try and do what I could to end as much suffering as possible on Earth while alive. So through this pathway, I've thought, man, do I have to get involved in politics in order to make a difference? I'm a part of a couple of nonprofits. I helped start a nonprofit. And it's dawned on me relatively recently, after having a corporation in the psychedelic space that was successful and was always committed to pro bono initiatives. It grew out of a desire to help specifically the downtown east side neighborhood of Vancouver that I'm sitting in right now. And I guess my latest conclusion in kind of response to what Brian said is, I think to perhaps at this stage in our evolution, I'm not sure capitalism is just going to disappear within the next 10 years. So perhaps the best game is for people that are well-intended to get into the corporate psychedelic space and be an example of what can happen. Liberty Root, my company, I'm in no rush to be first to market at this stage. I was first to market, then regulatory changes happened within Canada, so I can't provide Ibogaine within Canada, so I'm working through those regulatory hurdles right now. But my intent is to reopen Liberty Root one day with a real pro bono spin, whether it's a nonprofit or giving away the majority of the profits into our own pro bono initiatives. I think those are potential plays that we can look at. I get concerned. There is no shortage of people telling us everything that is wrong in the world. That's a dime a dozen. It's very easy to do. What I'm looking for is solutions. And I get very excited at some of the creative solutions that come out of these journeys and have the potential to, as I referenced before, change the paradigm. Perhaps, I think if we do this right, people like Peter Thiel or people really in that competitive mind space could be the dinosaurs. They could be what's going extinct. I think I did a presentation years ago on psychedelic entrepreneurship. I proposed that psychedelic means mind or soul manifesting. Entrepreneurship is to do an undertaking. So psychedelic entrepreneurship is to manifest your soul into a business or undertaking. And what that looks like is taking these lessons of unity and connection and beneficence that these medicines give us and putting those into an undertaking. So that's the challenge I give to myself. That's the challenge I would make to everybody else is let's create the new paradigm. Let's stop looking at what's being done wrong and instead start focusing on what we can do right.
Yeah. To follow up on what Trevor and Brian said, also James, a couple of thoughts came to mind. One is I understand most of us would like psychedelics to be available to as many people as possible in the best circumstances as possible. What follows up directly from that is that if it's going to be available to everybody, everybody's going to come in, and that includes right-wing Republicans, fascists, and we conspiranoid people. We have a sort of bubble that was mostly sort of fringe politics, left-leaning, liberal. I myself am part of this. I come from this. But I realized that if this is open to everybody, all of these people will also be able to take psychedelics, and they might have very different experiences. With that said, I was wondering, listening to Brian, if Peter Thiel could be also described as a bad actor within his scene. So, when we compare to what Trevor said about how he approaches business, and then what you said about how Peter Thiel approaches business, you realize that within the same field, there's very, very different ways to go about things, and some ways are actually quite rough and rude. And it seems that we are, at least in part, getting already the bad actors from the corporate world, which I think is interesting. And then, last but not least, to talk about something that is going to be keeping me busy for most of next year is trying to come up with a proposal for exactly what I would like things to be like 20 years into the future when these substances are fully integrated. Because I realized that, I've been an anti-prohibitionist, all of my life. I actually don't have a very clear idea of what comes after the end of prohibition. And I really don't. And when I look, for example, at what happened in the United States with Oxycontin, where you have like a fully regulated and controlled market that is only distributed by doctors, and still, a company managed to make itself incredibly rich by basically making everybody addicted to a highly addictive substance, and this was with all the regulatory controls in place, right? So, we're talking about, substances, that as William Burroughs said, they create their own clients. They create a demand for more of them, at least some of these substances. So this is of course the ultimate capitalist product. So what I'm trying to do is putting all of these pieces together and trying to really think about what future I would like. A future of, for these substances, what does it mean? What does it mean to change the relationship of Western societies to, psychoactive plants? What does it look like? Is it regulated? Is it not regulated? Is it a commodity that is sold? Is it a commodity that you can't sell? Is there space for businesses? Is there space? What happens to for example, to the ayahuasca religions? What happens to indigenous people who believe, and I'm trying to really make it, inclusive and think about all the different stakeholders, because I feel, I realize, at least for myself, I actually had no idea. I don't have a very clear proposal of this. I know what's bad. It's bad that now people don't have access. It's bad that people have to go to jail for using these substances. It's bad that their potential, and their promise is not being fully explored. But actually, I realize I'm not so clear about what is it that would be the good of this. What would the other side of this, and what would it look like? So, on a personal level, we're putting a lot of work on this, and this revolves around two types of responsibilities. One responsibility is the responsibility, let's say, of the governmental bodies, and all of the policies and the laws and the things and the economics that need to change. But another responsibility has to do with the basis. You cannot have leverage for negotiation with administrative bodies if you don't have numbers, right? If people don't organize themselves and get together in collectives that then can have leverage to make demands or push things in one direction or the other, then, well, that's just not how our system works. It's a numbers game. So there's also, there's two parts of this. One is bottom up, and it's how, organizations like Marta's or Marisa's and, many other things that are coming up begin to do this. And another one is how it meets from the top with the work of, administrations, governments, local governments, exactly, etc. And like I said, we've only recently started with this, a team of us, and it's going to take us a good few months, and we hope that at the end, at least, we have a clearer idea of where we would like to go, what we thought would be a sensible, ideal proposal for this.
I have some thoughts. We're seeing a lot of trends happening right now with advancements of technology and the pandemic and endless information, and people are becoming a lot more self-reliant. And they're also becoming a lot more community-reliant. And there's a lot of opportunity here, or I think the need is that people are becoming much more aware of the need to become interconnected and support each other. And I think that in my futuristic vision of the world is what's going to regulate, is that we hold each other accountable and we start to create the ecosystem of positive peer pressure and of uplifting what is good. And that, as power becomes more decentralized, because we see that shift slowly unfolding too with crypto and new power structures within internal governments and organizations, that, this is a trend that's really compelling. And it's what the psychedelics are teaching us. And in my vision of a future where corporatization of psychedelics doesn't take over, it's because within internal communities, we have our own ecosystems. You grow your mushrooms in the closet, and when you're not dealing with them in a good way, your community is coming at you and saying, hey, you're over-administering 5 grams to somebody who's brand new. Stop doing that right now. And, I think what I see coming and what I hope to help facilitate in any way I can, and what I see this conversation facilitating, is more of that mycelial network where we are connected so deeply that when we do, and actually a handful of us in this conversation have dealt with certain practitioners who are out of alignment in different parts of the world. And then and when they go to other parts in the world or are platformed in a conference, we're letting each other know, hey, so-and-so is getting platformed. So it's happening. And I think as we continue to put our energy into reinforcing that web more and more and more, this will gain such a power. And at some point, people are going to be like, hey, we don't need to spend whatever $800 fucking dollars for ketamine when there's a local way of getting it. And so I say put our energy into what is working. I second that, and continue to really support and nourish that. And I'm hoping that similar to the Satoshi guideline of principles that was developed for cryptocurrencies that helped that unfold, that we create a similar set of principles that can become unified, that everybody can agree on, very simple, but that are perhaps a framework for us to work within our own communities. That it's just like, it's like basic ethics, you know, and somehow figure out a way to maybe measure it to some degree and abide by that. And I don't know, that's, maybe it's a little too optimistic, but this is where as I put energy towards that, it has brought back reaped rewards, and I feel there's hope in that. I want to like give a shout out to the psychedelic community, because I think we're as Marisa said, the kind of like positive peer pressure is already happening, and it's kind of amazing how everyone is like, how people are determined to make sure that whatever is happening now, it has it kind of like shows integrity of the community, but also like shows our ethical values. And people are trying to communicate to the corporates our values, and they're trying to enforce those values. So there are some initiatives like North Star that created like ethical pledge, and it's North Star has been working with big corporations to make sure that they do understand our values, and they kind of keep those values alive in their business models. Also, the community reacts really fast, and it's really amazing. So, for example, there's a group called Women in Psychedelics that was really kind of a big factor in working around psychedelic corporate conferences that started to happen this year. So, like, Corona kind of enabled initiation of a lot of virtual conferences that had like white males mostly on board, people who just entered the community, and a group of women of psychedelics gathered and started like a discussion. What should we do about this? Like, how do we make sure that those people do not separate from ourselves, and we are involved in whatever is happening? And there was a massive change. Those people started to listen, started to involve more people from indigenous communities, from minorities. So there's I'm also like optimistic as Marisa. It seems like our community is very determined to pass those values and to make sure that we're not gonna repeat the mistakes of cannabis industry, for example, and we kind of, maybe we will be kind of a way to initiate more like a compassionate capitalism. Like, those companies, if they pass those values, they will become an example that businesses can be done in a more compassionate way.
Hey, can I jump in? Yeah, I wanted to say also that the mobilization of the fact that, you know, these aren't always commodified objects. Like, it's a way of life. There's cultures of psychedelics that have been going on even in like weird white hippie communities going on, 60 plus years, that have been working in secret. Like, culture and the way you walk and the way you invite people in who've been doing these things for a really long time, and they have the music to prove it, they have the literature to prove it, they have the style to prove it. Like there's a way, I think, that we need to welcome in the people that can't get in the conversation, one, because these things are illegal, so how do we get like drug dealers, let's say, into a conference space safely? How do we lift up the communities of all types of people that have been doing these things for decades, if not forever if you look worldwide. So I guess a call out would be in terms of like inclusivity, to really see that culture is something that can be that force of like calling bad actors, those squares that come on the scene really quickly, thinking they know what they're doing, and then simultaneously they're stealing from you and crossing boundaries in all these different ways. Like in drug culture, those people are taken care of really fast. Like how do we deal with that in a way that is safe, but also like, dude, like you can't be doing this. Like this is not how we roll. And I think part of it is by including the voices of people who have never tolerated that to begin with, because it was part of their survival not to deal with those dicks.
I think something that continues to be something that I consider is around, like we're talking about the psychedelic community, and yet the psychedelic community isn't one thing. Right. It's like saying, the Canadian community, right? We're a lot of different people who have a shared interest or practice perhaps, but there's a lot of different perspectives and there's a lot of different levels of involvement and levels of, levels of involvement and ways of thinking about things. And each of us in some way or another are leading the culture in some way. We're all choosing to take active roles in contributing to culture making locally and sort of like trans-locally, such as, internet news sites, Lucid News, Psymposia, or, local group, or ICER is also very like non-local or whatever it is. And my continued wondering is how do we continue to forward that culture making in a way where we're not willfully or unconsciously disregarding the fact that there are large structural issues that exist outside of the psychedelic culture that are bad for everybody. In particular, they're bad for generally people who don't look like me, right? But they're bad for everybody, and that we have to be moving as though, yes, we're moving against this force, this dominating oppressive force, but also doing so in a way that we don't get caught up in being merely reactions to it, and that the way in which we're thinking, not just what we're thinking about or who we're thinking about or who we're talking about, but the way we're talking, the way we're interacting, the way that we're moving forward is itself an expression of the type of world we want to live in, personally and relationally, as much as structurally, politically, economically, etc.
Are we allowed to go twice in one round?
So I want to say something, but I also mindful that Anya has not spoken. Do you have something you'd like to say?
I suppose it's very brief, just what Marisa and Marta both said, the mycelium effect, the network. I'm part of the Women Psychedelics group, and it took us very quickly to organize like 20 of us to meet on a Zoom call and discuss those issues. And articles were written and awareness was raised again. So yes, nice work, Marisa and Marta.
Thanks for that, Anya. So there's a lot that has been put on the table, and I would really like to engage with it. I think that you all are really thoughtful and soulful people, and I think you deeply care about these things. But I want to be clear that the dominating oppositional force that James referenced in my understanding of the world is capitalism. And earlier, Trevor mentioned that we're not likely to get rid of capitalism anytime soon, and thus, like the evolution must include and invite the entrepreneurs to eat first. And I would say, first of all, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I will tell you that sometimes evolution is frightfully fast. Sometimes it results in extinction. Other times, necessity takes over. So what I would say, though, is that we need to dream bigger. And we also need to contextualize in a big and broad way. I'm currently teaching a class on psychedelic studies, and I'm finding that while I would really like to talk about pharmacology and harm reduction and culture and ethnobotany, that one of the things that I can't avoid is colonialism and the extreme violence that has brought us to the point where we are presently, where there is an entire culture that is rediscovering that which our ancestors violently destroyed through torture and murder. And so all I have to say is these forces are still here. Peter Thiel is somebody who is effectively a neo-fascist in his funding and support for Donald Trump, okay? And his work, his structural work to round up immigrants and target enemies of empire, okay? So in terms of what comes after prohibition, how do we vision these models? Well, this is something that Psymposia is committed to doing in terms of policy papers and working with others to really vision the world that we would like to live in, this world where perhaps a bad trip is less likely. But just like defunding the police, to defund the police, you don't just defund the police, you fund education, you fund social workers, you fund houseless people by providing houses. You change the fabric of society, which is why we are very clear that we are allied with broader left movements, and thus we reject these psychedelic exceptionalist ideas where somehow, because we like to go to Burning Man and because we're usually pretty white people, that like it's super ironic that what's basically indigenous technology, where it hasn't been sort of moved around in terms of its molecular structure by, say, Alexander Shulgin or Albert Hoffman, the base material for psychedelia is indigenous technologies for consciousness alteration. And so look, like, I have a long pedigree of being a psychedelic cheerleader. Yeah, take the drugs, feel the feels, get the revelation, feel the wow, see the universe. I'm there. I feel you. But love and light casts a long shadow, and I am not an optimist. And I'm not an optimist because I've engaged with data. Things are dire. California's burning. The seas are dying. Okay? We need to act as people in concert with other people and reject these like individualist models of salvation or of building of empires. So I don't know. I mean, with regard to North Star is rolling out the red carpet for corporate psychedelia in terms of like teeth and holding people accountable. These things we've talked about on this call. Holding people accountable, holding individual bad actors accountable. You gave this person too much, or you fucked this person you shouldn't have fucked. Well, guess what? Like, North Star has no method for holding any corporate actor accountable, and they won't even identify a bad actor. So I'm sorry, their ethics pledge is worthless. I would love to hear what anybody has to say about what I just said.
I would just like to add. I'll speak shortly. As far as North Star goes, I haven't followed anything that's come out in the last couple months, but I know that their process was about engaging the community to develop the frameworks to develop those sort of steps of accountability, and that that was all a work in progress and engaging with other voices to help create that. So I think that's one reason why a lot of those concerns haven't been yet addressed.
Yeah, I think North Star is an evolving process, as is all of this. I like what Marta referred to when with the women's group kind of coming together. When I'm featured in a documentary called Dosed, and we showed that movie. It's about using psychedelics to overcome opioid use disorder. And in every single audience, the question came up around some of these key issues. And I was able to honestly answer that, yes, there are key issues that need to be discussed, and I see them being discussed every single day in the psychedelic community. Like the people in the community that I witness anyway are extremely focused on making sure that inclusivity is covered, making sure indigenous considerations are covered. I just got back this weekend from spending 4 days on an indigenous elder's property for the first time in 2 months to build the bridge. There were people in this group that had been in residential schools, and you wouldn't imagine the horrors that they face. So, me as a member of this community is doing all I can to dig deep into these issues to make sure that these are covered. And I think at the same time, I was told by somebody recently to stick to your knitting. And I think we need to focus our power. I think the left traditionally has been kind of overthrown by the fact that it divides and conquers and eats itself, while the right wing seems to be entirely focused and know exactly which way they want to go. So they keep coming back in full force while we, take people with really good intents, pick on one thing and destroy them for it. I think there's, around the decriminalization issue, I am all for decriminalization of all substances. MAPS Canada is all for decriminalization of all substances. So is the Canadian Psychedelic Association. But the petition that we just got before the federal government focused on plant medicine specifically. Yes, we want everything covered, but we're focusing on one PowerPoint, one wedge that we might be able to get into the system and work with it. I'm not sure. I've as I mentioned before, I'm focused on trying to end suffering. I've been looking at linchpin ideas. The first petition I had before the federal government was our corrupt banking system, our corrupt international banking system. If there was one thing that we could fix to help end a lot of the suffering on Earth, it would be fractional reserve banking and printing money out of nothing and having that power concentrated in one group of people. I feel like psychedelics is another one of these linchpin things, and that's why I focus on it. But in the meantime, I simply don't have the resources to focus on everything else that needs to be fixed on Earth. And I don't know if I should be held responsible for doing that, but everybody pick their specialty. We're all in alignment on a lot of these things, and let's move it forward. And when I spoke about the entrepreneur, it wasn't at all about the entrepreneur getting fed first. My entrepreneurship has led to over hundreds of people getting well, and in the meantime, I've done pro bono initiatives in order to pay back and help people who wouldn't normally have access to these plant medicines. And I'm definitely not done that journey. So it's about practicalities for me right now. I figure if I am trying to overthrow the capitalist system, which I think if we're going to throw it, we better have a really good replacement for it, because it's keeping a lot of people alive right now. And I just simply don't have the resources to do that. And is that the psychedelic community's responsibility? I think we should definitely keep our eyes on the broad picture as we move forward. But at the same time, I think we need to stick to our knitting.
I'd like to build on that too, and just one of the psychedelic principles that I keep coming across in my own work has been put your attention on what you want to see to grow. And I in my own journey work, I've seen how do you rehabilitate the criminal system? How do you help a so-called criminal who has been committing crimes, harming others? You don't actually make progress in helping them change their ways by punishing them and putting them into the cell and separating them. You help them by connecting them, by supporting them where they have strengths, by making them feel valued, by helping them understand new systems. So in my mind, if we put our energy into connecting the parts that work and putting our energy into, again, weaving the web and continuing to uplift everything that works, it will thrive on such a high level that you don't need to necessarily fight all the bad guys. I mean, definitely call it out, but put the energy into building the solution, and trust that it will overthrow capitalism. I have no doubt. I just don't. I think it will be faster if we nourish.
I just want to very quickly engage with a couple of things that have been put out there. So first, Trevor, thanks for putting out something that seems to have been engaging with the fractional reserve banking system. I'm aware that David Graeber, just passed away, and he was an anarchist anthropologist who wrote The Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So I would recommend everybody read that because his understanding of the monetary system brought him to the politics that he advocated for his whole life. That said, the idea of staying in one's lane, which is what I'm hearing from like a statement of like stick to your knitting, as far as I'm aware from my own experience and from what I've heard from others, psychedelics are about dissolving boundaries. And, it's a multidisciplinary kind of thing. So, I just wanted to respond to that.
I just want to address the issue of optimism because I feel like I'm obviously not naive, and I don't see the world going into like positive direction. I'm optimistic about the response of the community to what's happening, and the fact that we have a discussion here also, and that everyone in the community is trying to arrive with a solution that takes into account those different opinions. That's amazing, and that people are trying to be proactive. People are taking a lot of their own time. Everyone seems to be very emotionally engaged in all of this work. For me, that's the reason to be optimistic, that we are doing whatever it's possible. We don't know whether it's going to work or not, but like everyone is really pushing hard to resolve it and to make sure that we are being heard and that our ethical values are being passed on those corporate institutions. And I just want to say that I have to leave the call because it's really late here in the Netherlands. So thank you so much for talking with me. And thank you, James, for inviting me. And
Thanks, Marta.
Thanks, Marta.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Good night.
Yeah, I mean, I do like this stay in your lane thing, and the idea that psychedelics can do these gigantor things and the way we weaponize them for our agenda. I love what one guy said about they're the ultimate capitalist object, and that's something that I think we all need to hold responsibly. It's kind of true. So how do we not lay a trip on these trip drugs?
Hey, Bet, can you tell me a little bit more about what you were saying about psychedelics being the ultimate capitalist object? Like, who said? Just a little bit of elaboration would be great.
I think that was Jeronimo that had said that, and I think he was referring to opiates and oxycodone.
Oh. Yes. Okay, I do think that psychedelics, too, are the ultimate capitalist object. And I'm aware, especially with a book coming out, how different this book is compared to my coming-of-age queer novels. Like, it's getting a whole different level of attention. And I think it's really easy for almost anyone to to weaponize, mobilize, ride that white pony on over into a different place in their life. I mean, you see it with ideologies, the way, let's say, QAnon people went from, it's not obviously about Instagram followers, but you can hop on this thing and get a fair amount of capital, social capital, all of it. And I think that's one of the things that we need to communicate to the world is as beautiful as these things are, we need to go deeper in what it means to really walk with our own path with them, especially as the people who are approaching being elders. Like I was just watching Kathleen Harrison talk with Eric Davis, and really hearing these elders speak about what psychedelics have meant to them. It's an essential voice right now. So a basic tenet in Indigenous ways are to honor elders, and I think that's a really good first step. Is like I was always taught, like whoever's the oldest in the room, let them talk first, and so I think there's a kind of basic thing, because I think everybody from like your local person who needs to make money in the middle of a pandemic, beginning to consider growing mushrooms in Oakland, to like the corporate guy who's going to like ride on into mansion life in the on some island somewhere. It's to be considered that this stuff really can take you to another place, and to just be humble about it. I mean, I don't know. The genie's out of the bottle in such a huge way that I think it begs humility in terms of judging other people's the way they walk. Like I think we really need to kind of just chill on some of the like structural judgments, because we don't know what's going to happen, let's say 20 years from now. I'm not even going to say 50, because I don't even know if 50 is like an option at this point, but like, let's say Peter Thiel, for instance, like what would Peter Thiel be in 20 years if we like surrounded him and had some conversations? Perhaps, I don't know how you get in that room. I'm just a writer, but these things are grandiose. These things are easily mobilized. Humility's in order, and listening to elders is in order. Yeah, smart people too. We need to listen to really smart people.
I suppose just to quickly add, to give platform to smart people and elders as well. Build more platforms where they can connect them with the community.
And maybe of all, not necessarily psychedelic people, maybe we need to link up with other academics, other healers, other Indigenous leaders who may or may not be interested in psychedelics.
And I would just suggest be kind as well. That's the first value that we've got for the Canadian Psychedelic Association is kindness. I think it goes so far, and recognize that people are generally trying to do their best, especially in this space from what I've seen over the years. And, don't be too quick to judge. Remember a larger context. I'll just share an experience that I've had with the Canadian Psychedelic Association recently. We're doing our best to put out some high quality content. We've had some really good webinars, had some really cool speakers so far. We've done a few webinars on ibogaine and iboga, and the first one that I hosted was just me and Adrienne from the movie Dosed. It was the two of us for about an hour and a half, and talked about her journey, our journey with that movie coming out, talked about the medicine, of course, and it was beautiful. And the next ibogaine webinar that we had, I had people within the board of directors who really wanted to hear me speak to some people that I've treated over the years. I've got a unique position in that I was working legally with this medicine when I was working with it. So I'm able to come out of the closet, as it were. And I put out the call to some people that I had treated. It happened to be 3 men who answered the call, and I scheduled the webinar. We put the webinar up. One of the gentlemen happened to be Muslim. He offered this really unique perspective. I haven't met too many Muslim people in the ibogaine space, at least. Really great story. But as soon as we announced the webinar, we got tremendous blowback for not having any women on the webinar. And why aren't we adequately representing women? And, valid, I guess. I looked at it within the context of we had a full hour and a half with a woman last time. So that was my framework. So we decided, great, let's have an evolution of this podcast. We will have a webinar. We'll have a webinar with all women. It featured an MD who hosted it, plus 3 amazing women. One of them has been adopted into a Bwiti tribe in Africa, married by a Bwiti priest. And we announced this webinar and then got incredible blowback because we didn't specifically have anybody from Africa on the webinar. And again, a valid concern, although we had somebody that was able to speak to that context very well. And we're going to have an evolution of that webinar, and we're really going to bring on some Indigenous leaders. I think our goal is to have 1 a month with different Indigenous leaders. But yeah, we just took a lot of heat. We're all volunteers. We're just doing our best. We're doing what we can, and I understand and happy to hear everybody's perspective. And at the same time, you know, let's throw each other a bone and just have that degree of kindness and you know, compassion and expectation out of the gate that people are perhaps just trying to do their best.
So I'm a big fan of kindness. I think it's the one thing that I look for in friends and collaborators. I'm also aware of a statement that comes out of activist spaces, which is do better. And it sounds like what, you know, Trevor is describing is him and his you know, organization's efforts to do better. And for that, I commend those efforts. It's worth mentioning, though, that you know, identity politics is often sort of saddled on the left as this thing that only the left does and engages with. And yet, if you look on the right, the identity of sort of white, cis, het Christian men is so valorized that it's blinding. And that perhaps is why there is like a real pushback that comes from, like, I think in most senses, like a genuine place. However, I am aware that there are cases in which it can be weaponized by both the right and the left. And in those cases, I would say, are we working with people whose other values are in alignment with what it is that we're trying to do? For instance, I don't think a panel on psychedelic medicine would become more complete by adding neuroscientist and African-American Ben Carson to the panel. Do we all know who Ben Carson is? Well, just so we know, Ben Carson was a former Republican candidate, and he is now he's in Trump's, cabinet. He's the director of the housing in the United States.
And he's a neuroscientist too, right?
And he's a neuroscientist. So would that adequately fill out my my panel? I would argue that would be an inappropriate selection. So, you know, there are limits to these discussions. And I think it comes down to where we're trying to go. And there are people like Cornel West has talked about black faces in high places, and how liberalism and neoliberalism is sort of notorious for valorizing, say the disabled drone pilot, right? So this is somebody with a minority identity who also may have a job killing people. So I have a more unified view of where I would like to go, and psychedelics is part of it. And it is an anti-capitalist worldview. And so when I see the encroachment of people who would like to effectively enclose the commons, because I would argue that medicalization is actually more exclusionary than decriminalization, and perhaps even the current status quo. Because, let's just be honest, currently I haven't had health care for over a year and a half. And were I to get healthcare, I'm not sure that mental health would be covered. And were mental health covered, I'm not sure that in the next 5 years, psychedelic mental health would be covered. So in our discussions about, say, whether or not psychedelics or psychedelic medicine or the psychedelic movement are inclusive of, BIPOC people, some of this is class mediated. I would say a lot of it is class mediated, and much of it is structural. So where are we going? What's the strategy? I understand that MAPS has put a lot of effort into the FDA model and whatever is the analogous structure in Canada for medicalization. But let's be clear, medicalization is not decriminalization, and medicalization is not access.
Medicalization is not access for everybody, for sure, but it is access for a lot of people that would not normally even consider
or
it.
what we would call globally the rich.
Yeah.
Perhaps in the States, my dream is we've got a socialized healthcare system here. Wouldn't it be great if? And at the same time, I'm on the board for MAPS Canada, and I see that medicalization is not going to create the tsunami of healing I think these plant medicines can create and have the potential to create. I think it's one step. I think it's a really good tool in changing the conversation and getting the right people to pay attention. But yeah, decrim is where it's at for me.
I mean,
Yeah, well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bet.
Being in a small barber shop in Lubbock, Texas, with a war veteran who was like, all this bullshit about medicalization, I'm just going to grow my own, and he proceeded to tell me more about medicalization than I could have read in 3 days, so it's not access. You can grow mushrooms. The movement that you're seeing online, or where people who don't have access are seeing through the internet, is inspiring a grow your own movement. So it's who knows how it's going to pan out, and it's always in movement and unfolding. So as one of y'all said about, you did a conference and it just had really bad optics because it was just all white guys. That's a moment in time that can change tomorrow. And what you do tomorrow can affect what happens underground. It's, think about this psychedelically and fractally. How is all of the relationships that are not just in your own personal little world being affected by what you're doing? And it's not always going to be negative. It could be amazing.
Yeah, I think this is operating on so many different levels, in the sense that medical, I grew up in Las Vegas. My parents were working in customer service. They had insurance, and I know that's something that was going on much easier way back when, but had they been approached with, hey, this is a legitimate tool that is helping deal with these issues, and their mind be open to that, then they would be a lot more open to working with it now. And so that's happening on one level. And on the other level, we have stories coming out constantly, books being written, of people working with these things on their own. So it's not like that information is going to disappear. That's going to simultaneously grow and flourish and flourish. So what I see why medicalization doesn't scare me too much is I think it legitimizes these medicines as tools to the people that need that endorsement from that organization and the governmental authorities, and simultaneously we just keep doing what we're doing on the underground, and that they parallel, or maybe zigzag and do all. They
parallel, except that they're not non-rival. They are rival. I'm happy to do a yes and medical model. I think that if you have complex PTSD and you really want to have a trauma specialist therapy session with somebody while you're tripping on acid or MDMA or a combination of whatevs, awesome. However, the idea that should be rivalrous to the idea that someone could recreate, do a different version of therapy that's self-directed. Not only is it rivalrous in the sense that these are competing models of healing, but actually, if we're educated about how capitalism operates, there is something called the exclusionary, principle. If you cannot exclude your customers from access to your product, your market is not going to work. And that is fundamental to what's happening with psychedelics right now, is that there will be regulatory capture from the Compass Pathways people that say, not only are we the only people with the certified, licensed clinicians, but we are the ones with the good manufacturing process patented crystalline polymorph psilocybin. Even though this shit, mushrooms grow from shit, from no assistance from humans. They've been doing it since before humans even existed. Okay, so when I'm describing the tactics that are rivalrous, they are trying to build a picket fence around the fucking cow patty, the cow pasture. Okay, they want to keep you out, and they want to make sure, and it's true, when MAPS has medicalized MDMA and it's going to be GMP MDMA, your MDMA dealers are still fucking out to lunch when it comes to the cops. I don't even know that this is going to be Schedule II in the United States at that point.
Except we're defunding the cops and
are we? I would love that.
Well, we're just saying, right? And capitalism could be, what did you say? Evolution happens in an instant, right? There's so many parallel things happening all at the same time. It's so, when you paint that picture, you painted the worst case scenario as though
I am describing the problem that we will solve, and I believe we will solve it. I have a 5-month-old child. Okay, and I've been staring down the barrel of climate change and civilizational collapse for 10 years. That's the heart of what I've studied. Okay, California's on fire. Look, the reality is that the Earth doesn't need us. 99.999% of all species on planet Earth are currently extinct, that have ever lived. Right. So if we want to have a different story, we either get right with nature or we don't. And capitalism runs counter on a very basic level: infinite growth. We're in violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Nothing grows forever. We don't return anything. And these are systems that are predicated on exploitation. Okay, so here we have indigenous, in the climate movement, there's something called climate debt. Certain people didn't contribute to all the carbon that we're dealing with right now. So why should they not be supported to deal with, adapting to the current conditions? And I would argue that here we are as a society talking about giving, mushrooms to people for their depression that is based in the dealing with our work day and all this kind of crap. And it's Mazatec technology. Okay. So there's not a single, is MindMed gonna fund, Huatle de Jimenez? No, they aren't. And guess what? North Star is not going to help them. Sorry.
I think my desire here that's coming up is sort of questing towards a degree of abstraction a little bit without losing the actual content level of what we're talking about here. And it kind of it's sort of nested in Brian, where you're coming from now and what you're talking about, and sort of a callback to something Trevor was saying around be kind. And something I was saying about, it's this really complex myriad of things. It's it's not the Canadian community. It's a complex web of multiple communities with different values and different ways of going about things. And although be kind is a great principle in general, be kind doesn't necessarily work when, for example, you're dealing with someone like Peter Thiel, who he makes it, and people in that category, they make it so, as Brian said, that there's a white picket fence, not just around the mushroom patty, but all around themselves. The only way a person in that situation can be taken down is in many ways with some of the sort of cultural technologies we have now, like call out and cancel and this kind of thing. And I think they have their value in some place. But this is where my curiosity around keeping a collaborative mindset, which without explaining is sort of like the opposite of a coercive mindset, and holding that while also recognizing that, be kind is great in principle, but it doesn't necessarily apply all the time. But depending on how we go about things, we're influencing how we see other stuff. So mindset stuff. And Trevor, you were talking about how, like you are doing your best with CPA to do better and be better and contribute to healing and positive growth in psychedelic culture and the alleviation of suffering in general. And yet you're getting torn down for making small mistakes. And to me, what I see in that is that we're in a situation where many of us are rightfully angry about the situation that's happening around the world. And many of us, I think, in good ways, are righteously angry for people who don't have a voice to be angry about what has been done to them as a consequence of the evolution of our civilization. And that the people who are mostly responsible for that are people who are pretty much totally untouchable by us, the angry people, without certain technologies, such as call out and cancel and whatever. But that if we, especially in an era where the internet is the primary way that we're getting information and engaging with each other, if we are in a situation where the majority of how we're sense making is being inspired by technologies that are right now serving a capitalist agenda by going through this race to the bottom of the brainstem and limbic hijacking, and we're being perpetually influenced from being from a sort of righteous adversarial, like I'm going to tear it down, or even just be kind, or whatever it is. Social media is very like traffic and outrage. Then we're influencing how other people are going to think and be in the world as well. And when we do that, and we do it in a way that makes sense for someone like Peter Thiel, but it doesn't make it possible to actually do anything about it for the person who's being inspired by this outrage or this self-righteous indignation, we leave people in a place where they're going to end up wanting to express that elsewhere. And then they go for the lowest hanging fruit. And so instead of acknowledging what, say, Trevor, you were doing, you become a place in which people can express this sort of outrage, rival, tear them down, which is really better place for people like Peter Thiel, right, or Donald Trump than they are for you. And there's somewhere in the middle where, yes, feedback is important to grow and evolve the thing. So that's where my wondering is around how do we both respond appropriately to the reality of the situation that we're in, that we are going to be better off if we're just kind with each other and start there, but also we're in a situation where we got to do some serious sort of mobilization against the forces that will otherwise lead us to our own inevitable destruction, which maybe the planet will benefit, but I think that humans could bring a lot of beauty and wonder to the world if we could just, like Brian said, just get right with nature in a way. And again, I go back to this question of like, how are we both showing up to what's happening, but in a way that is expressive of the emotional maturity and the mindset that enables us to be collaborative while appropriately managing tactics of adversary and adversarial response for the people who deserve it, not necessarily the people we can easiest access. And I feel like I'm taking over my time here, but a great example for me, there's this amazing cafe here in my city who for years now put themselves out as like a anarchist vegan cafe thing, that they were trying to do this thing, and their prices are super manageable, or have been anyways. And they wanted to create a cultural space for vegans and sort of like discourse and all the rest. And they also recognize that there isn't any money in that. So the way they sustain their business is having a coffee bar that includes dairy products. Yeah. And a vegan group here in the city, understandably upset about the fuckness of factory farming and all the rest of this, took it upon themselves to start an international petition to demand this cafe take away their dairy products because they're propagating in the murder and this and that. And they were really self-righteously justified in their fight against the thing, but they couldn't actually reach big dairy. So instead they took the lowest hanging fruit. And my wondering is, as each of us, as contributors to culture making, how are we showing up in a way that inspires that type of nuanced collaborative mindset that is also an appropriate response to the context?
Nice example. There's a guy named Ben Burgess who put out a book recently. He's a logician, like as in he studies logic. And he wrote a book, I haven't read it yet, but I read his previous book, which was called Logic for the Left, Give Them an Argument. His new book is called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. And I do agree, that if we're to build a world that we actually want to live in, if we're to build a movement, if we're to build a psychedelic future that is about healing, we do have to lead with compassion, and we have to bring people into the fold. That has to be paramount. We have to meet people where they're at. And that means, I would say, rejecting something we might call liberal arts school privilege. Guess what? Not everybody went to fucking college, and they don't always know the right words for things. Give people a break every now and then. But we have to recognize people who are actually ideological, logistical, political enemies in what is a material fight for resources and policy. I'm sorry, politics is a zero-sum game. I don't make the rules.
I'm going to throw another idea in, something that I've been thinking about. But I've been wondering if this is really going to turn out to be such a good business as they think. For a number of reasons. One, because this sort of exclusivity, this comes from thinking about things like, antibiotics, right? With an antibiotic, it's not like you take an antibiotic, you tweak 2 molecules and you still have a similar antibiotic. You tweak 2 molecules and you have something that doesn't work. So these sort of like patents that revolve around molecules that come from very specific pharmaceutical drugs, psychedelics, having a patent of a psychedelic, even if it's a novel compound, how many more other possible ones there are out there. I mean, it's basically almost infinite. This is not, as I understand, this is not the case with other very specific drugs, anti-cancer drugs, etc. That's one thing. The other is that, a lot of the things that they have are, very temporary, even maps or, compass, they're dealing with very sort of short-term exclusivity. And third one, that I think, there's a lot of there's been an incredible amount of optimistic thinking that if you just, if you can make this clinical enough and clean enough and, and an aseptic environment enough and your screening is good enough, these are, perfectly controllable substance to handle. And, nobody's talking, which I think perhaps is good, or I don't know if it's bad, but, every 100 times, every 1,000 times, sometimes deeply, deeply profound, strange things happen. Things that are very difficult to handle. People believe that they're God. People believe that they're Jesus. I mean, all sorts of things happen. This is Pandora's box, right? But there's sort of what I perceive, coming from, people like Compass and all of this is like, oh, no. Don't worry about this. This is just because it was done, uncontrollably and, sort of out in the wild. So, I have a feeling that there is now sort of, in terms of speaking of, sort of purely the commercial stuff, there is a big gold rush. And there's some sort of like, idea or promise that people believe that they're making, that they can make out of this. But I think it could be that a lot of their thinking is flawed. The thinking around the exclusivity, the thinking about just how easy it is to work with these things, or I don't know what to call it, safety, I think there's a reason why it's only been sort of cowboys like Peter Thiel that are approaching this field, and most like quote unquote serious old school pharma is still a little bit, because pharma doesn't like things that explode in your face. And they have, this already started from the pharmaceutical ways. That's the history of LSD. It started with scientists, and it blew up in their face, before the hippies. it was already gotten to a place where, this was like, for the scientists, really sort of difficult to control and, and hard to understand and to manage. So, I would, also, give some credit to chaos in this equation. I think in spite of their best efforts, they might have generally sort of bitten more than can be easily chewed, or or that they're going to be comfortable chewing on. That's the other sort of thing that
I see, Trevor, you're about to jump in, and I want to apologize on behalf of the whole group that I've lost the time, and we are almost at the 2 hours. So I'm going to end this stage of the conversation. We'll go into the concluding thoughts here, and without being rushed, I ask you to be mindful of, I made the mistake of not tracking the time very well, and to keep our concluding thoughts as brief as possible. And so this last stage, we're going to go and we're just going to speak one clear, coherent, concluding thought. And then we're going to close out and say goodbye. And I'll start so that I don't necessarily have the last word here. And then it will go Anya, Trevor, Jeronimo, Marisa, Brian, Bet. And again, you can pass, and then we'll come back to you at the end. I think the concluding thought for me is something around how set is very important when we take psychedelics. We learn this. It's one of like the central things that any deep exploration into psychedelics, be it personal or sort of like research, collective, is that set plays a huge, huge role. I personally feel like setting and dose ultimately support the set or influence. It's all about set in the long run. And that if there's some sort of lesson we can take from psychedelics and bring into the world, especially around dealing with problems, is that our mindset changes the way we understand and engage the content of experiences that arises, and to be mindful of the mindset we have. Do we have a sort of self-righteous mindset of being like the champions of whatever? Do we have a, hey man, it's all good, like let's just like chill and like make love kind of mindset? Do we have a mindset that's more or less informed by our own traumas, compensational or otherwise? Do we have a mindset that is creative and inspired and impassioned? Do we have a mindset where we don't actually want to solve problems, we want to profit off them? Do we have a mindset where we don't actually want to solve problems, we want to be the victims of them? Like there is a lot of things that I think a deep self-reflection of the mindset behind why and how we're engaging problems is I think for me it's something that I'm holding deeply as I continue to wonder about this question.
Thanks, James. For me, to sum up, will be going back to the mycelium, because we tried, with all the problems, we tried calling in first, and we sent loads of emails to people, and we tried to coach them and train them and tell them what to do, and that didn't work, and it was really time consuming. Then we tried calling out, and that's also really time consuming. But what we ended up with is this group of researchers that are kind of waking up and saying, hold on, those are not my values, I don't want to work with it. And this is my hope, maybe, that those researchers that don't want to work in this corporate world or don't want to talk at those corporate conferences, that they will start building the different alternatives. And I really hope there will be some philanthropists that will see this massive need for not-for-profit approach, and someone that will actually care about healing people. And maybe those people can fund those kind of projects. This is my biggest hope for the future of this movement.
I think I wrote a piece called Why Psychedelics Are Not the Next Cannabis that you could Google. It's in Psychedelic Times, and it really spoke to what Jeronimo said. Like, I think these psychedelic offerings so far are not very good business models whatsoever. Nobody's really started a company going straight into clinical trials. That's normally done by well-established, highly funded entities. and the other one is MAPS, and it's taken Rick Doblin since 1986 to get MDMA as far as it's been. So I'm not sure. They may be trying to build a white picket fence around their venture. I don't think they're going to be successful. As far as the how do we approach people who might be bad actors, I love a quote that I'll paraphrase from A Course in Miracles that says, "There are only two emotions, love and a call for love, which might look like fear, anger, greed. Either way, love is the only appropriate response." And that kind of goes into what we were talking about with kindness. Kindness doesn't necessarily mean, bending over for somebody. Kindness and love could mean, you're about to hurt yourself and the world, and we need to stop you. So finally, I would just say, for all of us within this movement, to move forward with faith. And faith to me is not faith in a bearded man in the sky. Faith to me is an operating principle, which is the opposite to fear. Fear is just an expectation, but of a shitty thing to come. Faith is an expectation, but of a good thing to come. And when we're acting from that fear spot, we're in that fight or flight mode. That makes us not quite as intelligent as we could be if we were operating from that faithful paradigm. So I do move forward with optimism. I think it's a smarter way to go, and I would encourage everybody else to do the same.
I lost. Was I going next?
Go ahead.
No, because no, I don't. I was thinking that I've been now involved with this, Jesus, I don't know, 20 some long years, getting to 30 years actually. And then, some in one way or another, professionally for nearly 20. And I always felt that there was great promise in these substances. And that's why I'm still here. But that's what it is. It's a promise. It's not a fact. It's not a given. It's not a granted. It's just promising. Nice baby.
You remind me of the babe. It's totally wearing a labyrinth outfit. Yay. So cute. Yeah. So, are you guys familiar with Ray Kurzweiler? Singularity is now. The technology is advancing exponentially, and we are advancing along with it. We are evolving, and we're moving faster and differently and more complex. And at the same time, these values of love and faith are proving not only more pleasant, but also proving to be more efficient as operating mechanisms. And so as we evolve, as we move forward, we become more efficient. And I believe that the set with which we're looking through the world, the gaze through which we hold our world is what defines it. We see this over and over again. So I really second so much of both Trevor, James, and the mycelial network, Anya, but how we hold a vision for what's moving forward is what's going to create it, 100%. And I think with the fact of all these systems evolving parallel in ways that are so hard to predict, that really just holding a clear vision of that faith, that love will be the optimal operating mechanism is what will keep us on that track. And really creating from that space that it is possible. Let's just fucking hold it very clearly in our heads.
Hello, this is Thorn, by the way, little Thorn Ambrose. Thank you again, James, for hosting this. I think this was, a good use of time. I want to say that MAPS has definitely been the leading edge of the wedge in the psychedelic conversation. That's absolutely undeniable. However, the 30 years of fundraising that Rick Doblin has spearheaded has been dwarfed in the last 5 years by private investment in this space. It's a fact. And we would do a disservice to ourselves to ignore that fact, that there are plans and there are secret plans. And while I would like to have faith, and I respect those of faith, Maya Angelou said that when people tell you who they are, you should believe them. And J.R. Ron of MindMed, the CEO, said he wants nothing to do with those decriminalization people. And I'm telling you that decriminalization is like pulling the rug out from these corporadelic actors. And so while I don't want to undermine, those of faith, I do want to offer something, and it's called praxis. If you believe in a better future, act to create it. Thank you.
Hey, I don't have any answers. I'm a writer. But what I do, I guess, as a writer is I look and I see, and I took, I did my first 30-gram dose of mushrooms about 2 months ago, and I saw everyone who I'd ever met in the psychedelic community up till this point, and a lot of people who I kind of positioned myself in opposition to, and I was like, oh my gosh, I love you, And I really do feel that there's a lot of influences coming in that's corporate to a level that we have never seen or dreamed of before. So some of the actors that I position myself against, I have a much more big and open heart towards as we approach just all the problems we're facing as humans right now. So again, it's sort of ending on like love and I think inclusivity is huge, and that means everyone who does these substances, from like the wooks to your mom who read Michael Pollan and wants to go to the doctor, So it's holding that for me in a sense of like mystery and compassion. It's not my job to really care how people are doing it. I'm just trying to keep my own practice going, which is as a writer and as a psychedelic practitioner. So I appreciate being here today with you all.
Okay, great. Thus closes the Psychedelic Cafe. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and also for what each of you are doing independently to contribute to us working together to respond as appropriately as possible to what's happening, and that we can continue to move towards the better world we all want to see. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. Thanks, everybody. Nice seeing you all.
Thank you. Nice to meet you,
James. Thanks, everybody.
Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
James. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night or day.
Bye.
Okay, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind, a Psychedelic Cafe. Now, if this is the first time you've ever tuned into the show, we don't normally do cafes. Typically, it's one-on-one conversations, and I like to pepper the cafes in from time to time because I feel it offers something totally different than a one-on-one interview can offer, and they each have their value in different ways, and I love doing cafes. I find it really fun and interesting as much as I love doing one-on-one interviews. So if you are interested in more psychedelic content, be it cafe style or interview style, then please subscribe to the show wherever you're checking it out, be it audio or video on YouTube. Additionally, if you like this episode or you found that something in it seemed important, share it with somebody. And don't just share it with somebody who you can talk about it with afterwards, or even just talk about it in general, sharing it or not. I mean, sharing it's good for publicity, not publicity, like analytic metrics and helping more people get involved with the show and the content, but even just have a conversation with other people, chew on these ideas, and oh my God, ABC it with others, like chew on it, pass it around. I mean, that's not COVID friendly, but just keep it in your pod, like a piece of gum that doesn't lose its flavor, hopefully. that's a great way to support the show. And I think it's a great way to support the intention of the show, which is generative discussions that build and grow culture while contributing to the sense of and development of communities within that psychedelic culture, within psychedelic culture. So do that. Also, yeah, I think that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you are enjoying your life, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. And until then, take care.